Hello, and welcome to 4.3, Day 1. We're going to be solving by factoring. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk like that the whole video. Alright, so remember our standard form was y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. Well, as you can see in this black part, I have a 0 there instead of a y. So what happens when I plug in 0 for y? What is that going to give me on my parabola? Well, when y is 0, I'm going to find my x-intercepts. So if we solve this black equation for x by substituting 0 in for y, we're going to get our x-intercepts. But before we can solve for x, we need to learn how to factor. But first, a couple of terms here. Monomial. So an example of a monomial is 4. Another example would be x. Also, 4x is a monomial. So when you think of mono, that prefix means 1. So monomial just means one term. And bi, the prefix bi means 2. So that's going to mean 2 terms. So we have like an x plus 4. Or we could have x minus 3. Those are binomials. They have to be connected by an addition sign or a subtraction sign. And then lastly, trinomial. Tri means 3. So same type of deal here. We're going to have 3 terms, and they need to be connected by an addition sign or a subtraction sign. And notice how that trinomial looks a lot like standard form of our quadratic function. So hopefully you remember the FOIL method, such as when we have x plus 4 and x plus 7, and we want to multiply these two binomials. You would take the first terms multiplied by each other, you'd get x squared, and the outer terms, then the inner terms, and then the last terms. And you would multiply binomials that way. Well, factoring is sort of like reverse FOIL. So instead of going from multiplying two binomials to a trinomial, we're going to go from a trinomial to binomials. So we have x squared plus 11x plus 28, and we want it in the form that looks like this. So we need to fill in our gaps here. We need 2 terms in the first spot that when multiplied together, they give us x squared. So those 2 terms would be x and x, right? X times x is x squared. We also need the last 2 terms to multiply together to equal 28. So let's think about the factors of 28. We have 2 and 14 and 4 and 7. So we have a choice here. We can either do 2 and 14 in our last place or 4 and 7. But also keep in mind that we have this 11x term up here. So we need our 2 values that go in the last place to add up to equal 11. So 2 and 14 add up to be 16, and 4 and 7 add up to be 11. So we want 4 and 7 in our last spot. Now we just need these signs. So I want positives here because I have positive numbers in my trinomial. So in summary, when we have our product of 2 binomials, the last terms have to add up to our b value. Okay? And those same two terms have to be multiplied to be our C value. So add up to be B and multiplied to get C. Okay, we're going to try another example. So we have x squared minus 9x plus 20. Now remember, I need two values that added together give me negative 9, and when multiplied gives me 20. So rather than guessing and checking, I'm going to teach you a little method that hopefully will help you. Okay, so I have a big diagonal here, and I'm going to take my x squared and multiply it by 20. So that gives me 20x squared, and I'm going to put that on the top of my diagonals here. Okay, now I'm thinking, what are the factors of 20? Well, I have 1 and 20, 2 and 10, and 4 and 5. Okay, so I need to decide 1, 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5. Well, keep in mind we also need to add up to negative 9. Well, 4 and 5 add up to positive 9, but how could we make those values so that they added up to negative 9 and multiplied to 20? Well, what about negative 4 and negative 5? If we multiply those, we get positive 20, and if we add them, we get negative 9. So that's good. I want negative 4 and negative 5. So I'm going to write negative 4x over here and negative 5x on the other side. What happens when I add those two? I get negative 9x, that goes in the bottom. So now that my diagonals are complete, I look on the sides. Those values are what goes into my binomial. So I have x minus 4 and x minus 5. If you already saw what those values were going to be and you don't need to do the diagonal method, that's completely fine. The diagonal just help visualize what all is going on in the problem. But if you don't need that and you can think about the problem and come up with your binomial, then by all means do it that way. So here's another example, and I'm going to use my diagonal method again. So my outer terms multiplied by each other, I'll get negative 12x squared. Okay, looking at negative 12, I need to figure out the factors of negative 12. So I could have 1, 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. And obviously one of those values in each of those pairs needs to be negative in order for us to get negative 12. So we need to pick one of those pairs that when we add them together, we get positive 3. Well, let's look at the first one. If I had a negative 1 plus 12, I would get 11. Or I could have a positive 1 plus a negative 12, and I would get negative 11. So it's neither of those. What if I had a negative 2 plus a 6? I would get 4. Or I could have a negative 6 plus a 2, which is negative 4. So not that one either. Here I would have a negative 3 plus 4, which is 1, or I could have a negative 4 plus 3, which is negative 1. So it's neither of those. Therefore, this cannot be factored. Because there are no values that multiply together to give us negative 12 and add up to be 3. I would like you to try to factor this one on your own, so pause the video and good luck. This trinomial can be factored into the product of the binomials x minus 6 and x plus 3. I would also like for you to try this one, so pause the video. So this trinomial could not be factored because there is no value that when multiplied gives us 9 and when added gives us -3. This trinomial is a little different than the one that we have been dealing with because the coefficient in front of our x squared term is not 1 anymore. Here it's a 5. So that means in our product of two binomials, we won't just have x as the leading term. Here we're going to have a 5x and an x, because we still need our first terms to be multiplied to give us 5x squared. And only 5x and x will do that. So there are a couple different ways that we can factor this. There's a box method. So to do this, you need to set up a box and divide it into fourths. So the very first term, 5x squared, is going to go in the top left. And the very last term is going to go in the bottom right. And like we were doing before, we want to multiply our first term with the last term. So 5x squared times 6 gives us 30x squared. So this means I want to find my factors of 30. Well, those are 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, and 5 and 6. So out of these pairs, we want the one that adds up to -17, our middle term, which would be 2 and 15. If we had a -2 and a -15, and we multiplied those, we would get 30. And if we added those, we would get -17. So that's good. We want 2 and 15. So we're going to put that in the box here, -2x and -15x. Alright, looking at this first row here, 5x squared and -15x. What do they have in common? Well, they each have at least one x, and they each have at least one multiple of 5. So what we did there is basically take out the greatest common factor. Alright, looking at the second row, I have -2x and 6. So what do they have in common? It's a multiple of 2, right? And because the box closest to 2 has a negative, our 2 will also be negative. Alright, looking at the first column, we have a 5x squared and a -2x. So what do they have in common? Well, only an x they have in common. And the box closest to that x is a positive number, so x is positive. And finally, looking at our second column, we have -15x and 6. And what do they have in common? A multiple of 3. And the box closest to 3 is a -15, so we'll have a negative by our 3. And now we have our product of two binomials. We have 5x minus 2, right, that was from over here, and we have x minus 3 from the top. And then we could check our answer. So foiling would give us 5x minus 15x minus 2x and plus 6. And we factored correctly. Don't worry if you didn't like that method. There's one other method I'm going to show you, and it's called slide and divide, or some people call it bottoms up. And it starts off similar. We take our outer terms and we multiply them. So we'd get 30x squared. And we want to find the multiples of 30 again. So 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, and 5 and 6. And we need to pick our pair that when we add them together we'll get negative 17, and we decided that's 2 and 15, and more precisely it's negative 2 and negative 15. So with those values I'm going to set up my preliminary binomials. Okay, now we had 5 as our leading term for the x squared value. That means I'm going to divide by 5 on each of my binomials. So now I reduce. I'll get x minus 2/5 and x minus 3. So as you can see, our last binomial, the number reduced, but in our first binomial it didn't. We still have a fraction. So what we do is we take our denominator and we slide it in front of our x. So then we would get 5x minus 2 and x minus 3. And if you remember, that's the same answer we got earlier, and you just used a different method. So if the 3 didn't divide evenly, like if we had 16/5 and that didn't divide evenly, we would slide our 5 in front of this x value. So whatever doesn't divide evenly, you slide the denominator in front of the x value. I would like you to try this one on your own, use your notes, and you can use either method. So good luck. And I worked out both different methods so you can see whichever one you did and compare your answer, but you should have got 3x plus 4 times x plus 2. So here's a little bit different of an example where we can factor out common terms before we start anything else, because 36, 33, and 6 all have a 3 in common. So when I factor out my 3 from each term, that essentially means I'm dividing it by 3. So 36 divided by 3 is 12, and 33 divided by 3 is 11, and 6 divided by 3 is 2. You can always check yourself and FOIL that 3 back in, and you should come up with the same trinomial you started with. And now we're just factoring like we normally would, and we're just looking inside of our parentheses, so kind of ignoring the 3 out there and factoring like normal. So 2 times 12 is 24x squared. I need to find my factors of 24 and decide which pair adds up to negative 11. And that's going to be the 3 and the 8, right? If I had negative 3 times a negative 8, I get positive 24. And if I had a negative 3 plus a negative 8, I'm going to get negative 11. So we want negative 3 and negative 8. So we're going to set up our preliminary binomials, I like to call them, and do the bottoms up method. So my 12 up here multiplied by the x squared is my denominator. And now I need to simplify. So I'm going to get x minus 1/4 and x minus 2/3. So after we simplify, now we do our bottoms up. So 4 gets moved up and 3 gets moved up. So, oops. for my final answer, I will have 4x minus 1 times 3x minus 2. And please, please, please don't forget that we had a 3 out in front. I really should have been writing them along each step, but please don't forget we have that 3 out there. So that's the end of this video, and we're going to work some more problems in class tomorrow. So come with your questions and a good attitude.